Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Lawrence, professor in Religion Department at Duke University, and I'm pleased to introduce the speakers at this occasion when we are continuing the tradition of living history at Duke. History never stands still, time always moves on, but we are pleased that at this moment in time in the history of Duke and the Department of Religion, it's possible for three of us who are colleagues in that department to be hosting a visit of Imam Warith Deen Mohammed to the Duke University campus. And I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists and also my colleagues in the Religion Department in a moment. But I'd like to begin by thanking many groups who have made this possible. And first among them is Dr. C. Eric Lincoln, who is seated on my right, who is instrumental in both initiating and making possible the arrangements for this visit, and the Department of Religion, and also the Center for International Studies, and the Black Students Alliance, and the Living History Program, and Film and Video at Duke have all helped to make this event possible, as have many local Muslim leaders, and none more than Imam W.D. So we're grateful for all their effort and for the contributions they made to this event, which we are now going to film. And I'd like to begin on the far right by introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Vincent Cornell, who, like Dr. Lincoln and myself, is a professor in the Religion Department at Duke and is a specialist in North African Islam and in the whole pre-modern period of Muslim history, and is also himself an American Muslim. I'm pleased that Dr. Cornell could be at Duke, first of all, but I'm especially pleased that he could be at Duke and be with us this afternoon. Seated on my immediate right is Dr. C. Eric Lincoln, who presides as a giant in a land of pygmies. We all think we have stature until we sit next to or stand next to Dr. Lincoln. And he has achieved things which are monumental in any lifetime, and it is an awesome privilege to be able to call myself his colleague. And in all the years that I've known C. Eric, I never would have dreamt that I'd be here with him on a program like this, where we are esteemed to have a visitor of the eminence of Imam Warith Deen Mohammed. But Warith Deen Mohammed, like C. Eric Lincoln, shares a part of the history that we're going to see and that we're going to record this afternoon. And so I think it's especially fitting that he be included as the center figure in the three of us who are sitting opposite Imam Warith Deen Mohammed, who is on my left, and whom I have known on only one occasion, but that one of intensely good memory, when we were both representatives of the American American legation that went to Fez, Morocco for an international conference of the Tijaniyya. And Imam Warith Deen Mohammed and I enjoyed many moments together at that conference. And I hoped I'd see him again sometime, but again, I never dreamt it would be at Duke. I never dreamt it would be on an occasion such as this for living history. So welcome, and I'm very pleased to see you again here and to have you with us.
Thank you, Bruce.
I'd like to begin with you, C. Eric, and allow you to sort of initiate questions or to engage in a conversation with Imam Warith Deen Mohammed as you see fit. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Imam Mohammed, I'd like to reminisce a little bit. Since this is a program in living history, you and I have lived some history together. When I first met you more than 35 years ago,
Yes.
you were a member of what was called the Nation of Islam, which was headed by the Honourable Elijah Muhammad. And at that time, the Nation of Islam was considered a very exotic kind of movement. I was a young scholar at that time, and in doing research on the nation, I coined the phrase, the black Muslims in America, and it sort of stuck. Who were the black Muslims? Well, at the time, they were people who were very much concerned, in their own words, to learn the truth about themselves and to learn the truth about the white man. They were people who were engaged in trying to somehow offset the destruction and the turbulence and the pain of racial prejudice and racial segregation. And they were given to understand at that time that they were people who had a very distinctive history, that they were the people of Allah, and that it was Allah's will and intention that they would someday be restored to the unique positions of power and glory that they had once enjoyed. Their leader was your father, the Honourable Elijah Muhammad. One of the features of the black Muslim movement at that time was the expectation that there would be an Armageddon, a day of judgment, when the racial situation would be in effect reversed, when good would overcome evil and the black man would be restored to his place, his proper place in the world. The Nation of Islam at that time featured a number of very positive kinds of programs. For example, the Muslims were taught to own businesses so that they could be economically independent. And in that interest, they owned small bakeries and stores and restaurants and pressing shops. They also owned extensive farmland. They owned, at one time, a fish-producing business, and later they owned a printing plant, one of the most modern in the country, an airplane, and so on and so on. All in keeping with Elijah's teachings that you must be independent economically, you must be able to go for self, as he put it. There were other kinds of teachings. Among them was that the white man was a devil by nature, and that there would be no peace in the world until the devil had been subdued and had been overcome. In the meantime, the Muslims were taught to practice an intensive kind of brotherhood. Each Muslim was responsible not only for himself and his family, but for every other Muslim. The Muslims were also taught that to be respected, they must be respectable. They must give a full day's work for a full day's pay. They must not enter into wage slavery by immersing themselves in debt, that they must be willing to make the sacrifices that are always necessary for people to lift themselves. They were taught that they were a people apart, members of the tribe of Shabazz, waiting for the coming of the Armageddon, when they would be properly reunited with their true God, whose right and proper name, they said, was Allah. These were the days of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and later Louis Farrakhan. And these were the days when eventually you would be a minister in one of the temples yourself. Those days have passed. what is the reason for the transition, and what has the transition accomplished? Where is it going from here?
Dr. Lincoln, first let me express appreciation on behalf of my associates throughout the country for that very clear and accurate, you call it, I believe you used the term reversing back into history, reminiscing, and I had to express my appreciation because as you were relating it, I could see that time so clearly, and you didn't miss nothing that was important, I don't think.
That's his style.
Yeah, he missed nothing important. Nothing important was missed. I appreciate that very much. I see the transition as coming about because it wouldn't have been possible without first something happening or being already included in the teachings that you've just given us so clearly to make it possible. Something that was there to make it possible. And Elijah Muhammad, the late leader, and we always pray God's forgiveness for whatever his sins were or his errors were, and grant him paradise. His intent was good, was sincere, and we do believe that he was turned on to certain influences, certain language in his teachings that he received from Farad. F-A-R-D is spelled, but pronounced Farad. That was his teacher. And he knew it was his duty to keep those kinds of influences alive in us, especially in myself, as his son, that he hoped to one day succeed him, or at least follow in his shoes, as he would say, follow in his shoes. So I'm very, very clear and convinced that those creators of the Nation of Islam, the black Muslims, they intended for it to one day make a transition. I was selected as a person who would be a part of that. I was given the name Warith Deen Mohammed. One of the names that Farad himself used, he used Warith Deen. And told that from my mother and father and brothers and sisters, they all supported it. I was told occasionally when they would see me getting too interested in my associates or too interested in things that boys normally get interested in, they would remind me that I had work to do. I had to follow my father in his work. That was most of all responsible for it, but also changing times. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he recognized that America was changing. The civil rights movement was bringing about change. The attitude of the people, of the society itself, is not just the law was changed, but the attitude of the white people was changing toward us. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he wasn't ignorant of that. He began to soften some of his language, and by putting emphasis on other language. That's how he would soften it. He would put emphasis on other language and give less attention to the hard language. So Dr. Lincoln, that's what made it possible. Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of the great controversy that came about after the differences arose between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. I don't know if you remember, but I remember quite vividly that in the old days, when Malcolm first became a sort of spokesman for the movement, he was forbidden to speak before or to any white people. Mm-hmm. At that time, I was a graduate student at Boston University. Mm-hmm. And in a very intensive pro-seminar that we had there, I had let it be known that I knew Malcolm X, And there was a real interest in having Malcolm X come to Boston University and address the seminar, which included both professors and graduate students from Boston University, MIT, and Harvard. So I got in touch with Malcolm, and Malcolm in turn got in touch with Elijah Muhammad. And to everybody's great surprise, he was permitted to come and to address this very learned seminar at Boston University. I will never forget that the day Malcolm came in with an honor guard of about 15 Muslims, including his protege, Louis Farrakhan. The professor from Harvard who sat next to me said, "Oh my God, every one of them has on a Brooks Brothers suit." But history was being made at that moment. Malcolm came in, and in an hour and a half lecture, he had so impressed these very well-educated people that they gave him a standing ovation. The next week, I had a call from a person, from a professor at Harvard, that said, "Hey, can you get Malcolm to come over to Harvard and speak to us?" So I went through the same routine again. Malcolm went through the same routine, and lo and behold, he spoke at Harvard. Second time that he had ever spoken, or any Muslim had ever spoken, to anyone outside the black contingency. Okay. The next call I got was from Malcolm X. And Malcolm said, "Look here, Professor Lincoln." He said, "I don't mind speaking to those devils, but can't you get me a chance to speak at some black college somewhere?" So I sent him to Clark College in Atlanta, and then to Morehouse. And this began his ministry to college students all over the country. I just wanted to introduce that little figment of history because I think it is important.
It is very important. I recall Malcolm impressing my father as soon as he was released from prison. You know, he was serving time in prison for some violation. I can't recall right now just like what the violation was. But it was serious. He had, I think he was given a 14-year sentence. And he was about to come out. One of the members of the community, and also his brother, his eldest brother, named Wilfred.
Yes.
He had gone to the prison and had been informing Malcolm of what was going on in the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm had already accepted the religion, and my father was already aware of his sharp mind. So when he came out, my father immediately made him a minister. Made Malcolm the minister. And I recall him going on the college campuses at that time, the time you mentioned. In fact, I recall his engagements at those places that you mentioned, especially Clark. And he was very excited about that, Malcolm was. And I recall Honourable Elijah Muhammad reminding him of a danger. And he told him that he was allowing him to do things that he hadn't allowed any other minister to do. And it was because he had faith in him, he said. And he said he'd been waiting for someone who had the ability to speak his message and deliver it to a non-Muslim audience. He said that he wanted more visibility for the Nation of Islam. And that was the reason for it. He wanted more visibility for the Nation of Islam. He had begun to get into business, and he thought he was ready then to be introduced. He wanted to compete with Christian America, Black America, for the black following.
Well, here I had a bit of over-dicta, which I think is also important to be seen in the context. I think that Elijah's faith in Malcolm was well placed. And I'll tell you why. Despite the fact that after the controversy arose between Malcolm and Elijah, this for my money was largely a controversy in the press. The press did some very terrible things there, and also people who became instant authorities on the Muslims, who had never seen a live Muslim close up, who had never studied the movement and so on, put forth some projections and some theories that I think were most unfortunate and altogether untrue. I say that for a number of reasons. One is that during the days when I was researching the Muslims, Alex Haley, Malcolm X, and Lou, what was Lou's name? Newspaper man.
Palmer? Palmer?
No, not Palmer. I can't think of it at the moment, but we sat in a restaurant down in Harlem talking. And Lou was saying to Malcolm, you know, you are too smart to be following somebody called Elijah Muhammad. Why don't you pull out and go on your own and be somebody in the world? Malcolm leaped up from the table as if he had been stuck by an ice pick. He was so angry until his face was flushed. And I thought he was going to strike. You know, we have been friends for years, but don't you ever say that to me again. Don't you ever say that to me. He said that Elijah Muhammad is responsible for what I am today. Everything that I am, he made me. And I don't want you to ever say that to me again. I couldn't help but mark that in my memory. The next documentation of that sort that I had was I had come to know Elijah Muhammad, and I was out in Chicago on an occasion to interview him. It was a Saturday morning. And as you know, on Saturday morning, he very frequently called in his various ministers to teach them on Saturday so that they would know what to say on Sunday. Well, I was present at that meeting, at that teaching, and there were, I guess, 10 or 12 ministers seated around the table, very avidly listening to what Muhammad had to say, when the doorbell rang. And Mrs. Muhammad went to answer the doorbell, and she came back and she whispered to her husband, she said, "The boy is here." And in came Malcolm X, tall, gangling, gawking, grinning. I have never seen such affection between two men as when Elijah Muhammad got up and they embraced. You could see that this was a father and a son who not only respected each other, but who loved each other.
That's right.
The next documentation that I had of the mutual respect and affection between those two people was that at the height of the controversy when Malcolm made the remark about the Kennedy chickens coming home to roost, the New York Times and the Saturday Evening Post together commissioned me to do a story on what was happening. They gave me the largest advance I have ever received, and I flew out to Phoenix to interview Elijah Muhammad. Elijah told me at that time, he said, "It's nothing but a shame, it's a put-up." He said, "The boy knows that all he has to do is to come on home and take his punishment. He made a mistake." He said, "Islam means submission, so he must come and submit, and then we will go on as before." And then he made us another statement. He says, "But Professor Lincoln, I've got to know which way the wolf is going to jump." But he was fighting once more for the press, the inundations in the press, the things that had been said that had no relationship whatever to Elijah and to Malcolm or to Malcolm's so-called discoveries. Something that you said a little bit earlier fits in very well with what I knew all the time, and that is that in the latter years of his life, Elijah was beginning to gain quote-unquote respectability in the world community. He had made the transition from being purely exotic and someone who was altogether negative, and as you said, he was saying more positive things than he had said before, and he was getting increasing respect. To the Savior's Day meetings, by this time, the politicians were coming from Chicago, from New York, from Philadelphia. The businessmen from Chicago were sending representatives and so on.
Oh, yes.
Elijah was beginning to enjoy the respectability that he thought he always should have had people understood him. And at just this moment, at the time that he was reaching for respectability, Malcolm made his unfortunate statement. That would shatter any move toward respectability that Muhammad wanted so much. So he had to set Malcolm down. He had to set him down.
Yes.
And that was what that was all about. Those other tales by instant experts on Islam were most unfortunate.
Yes. I couldn't agree with more with that.
Thank you.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad was very hurt, and I happened to be at the house when he made the statement after Malcolm's assassination. He said, and he was sitting with his head kind of hung, and he was sad. He said, I wish they never would have done that. That's what he said.
Yes.
And I've expressed this before to the people of the press, you know. And I couldn't see it. That relieved me, because I knew their relationship too, like you did. And I couldn't see how that relationship had really changed to one of hate or
No,
for each other.
It did not. It did not.
It was instigated. It was instigated.
One
Fear and
other
distrust.
thing. After Malcolm had gone to the Middle East and Africa and so on, during this period of contention, and had come back to the United States, he was going to hold a press meeting at the New York Sheraton. I was living in New York at the time, and I went down to the Sheraton an hour before the time of the press meeting because I wanted to talk with Malcolm privately. I said, what are you going to do? He said, to tell you the truth, Professor Lincoln, I don't know. But there's one thing I am not going to do. I'm not going to start any counter movement in opposition to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He said, I couldn't do that. He said, I might open a school to teach people how to be Muslims, but I am not going against my teacher. That is what he said to me. That is not what came out in the press.
I know. But he became a very desperate man, and it was because the language that was used by the ministers and captains and their lieutenants was of the nature to signal violence against Malcolm. Not to order it directly,
Yes,
but to trigger it. Yeah.
Could you say anything about where Louis Farrakhan was in all this at that time?
He was among the ministers, and wasn't any single minister to blame for that kind of language.
Yeah.
It was being a son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and knowing his teachings, his laws, very well. When Malcolm was charged with being one that's trying to undermine the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's credits. And he was later charged with that because he got desperate and he made attacks upon the person of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I would have to say that I would have had to make a decision that would have been very hard for me, whether to join that language, join them in that kind of language, or separate from it. That would have been a hard decision for me. I wasn't in the nation at that time. I had been excommunicated too. I was excommunicated, so I wasn't there at that time.
What year is this roughly?
This is about 63,
63,
about 64, pardon me.
63, 64.
64,
Yeah.
More 64. 64 and, yeah, 64. And, but if I had been there, I would have had to, I think I would have had to, I would have left. I would have had to leave. I would have just had to be put out, you know, for not joining that language. I know me, I couldn't have joined that kind of language. But it would have been difficult for me to make that decision because we felt that if anybody threatened the power, image, control of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that we were supposed to condemn them and not to hesitate, you know. We were supposed to be against them, very, very strongly against them. If I wasn't prepared to make that decision, then I knew that I had to be prepared to be excommunicated, you know. And I don't blame any particular minister. I blame them only for human weaknesses, envying Malcolm's popularity, resenting his closeness with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I blame them for those human weaknesses, but not for the climate that they created in which violence was done to Malcolm.
Yeah. You say you yourself were actually excommunicated at
Yes.
that time. For those who don't know about this, and this is a living history program, what happened between the time you were excommunicated till you came back as the leader of the and the successor to Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, I kept coming back. The first time I was excommunicated, it was for, I was suspected of giving Malcolm information on the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's private life. I was innocent, but I was excommunicated. I asked that I be heard with Malcolm, that they wouldn't grant that to me. When I say they, I mean the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the spring captain. They were holding a hearing. They had a hearing. They didn't grant that, so I had to be excommunicated.
And what did that mean? What did you have
Excommunicated meant that you don't have any contact with anyone in the Nation of Islam, including your relative. I couldn't call my mother. Wow. Even if I heard she was sick, I couldn't call the house and talk to her. That was his rule. That was the rule. And that was to make you think very seriously about going outside the. You know, if you go out, you're out. Yeah. You go out, you stay out. That's what it was for. Yeah. So I disobeyed those rules. I didn't get to talk to my mother on the phone, but I tried to call a couple of times. So I said, well, they ain't gonna let me talk. So I wrote letters. I would write letters, ask them how they're doing, and I admit that I was using it to open them up again. You know, it wasn't just to keep in touch. Sure. I knew that I could open them up. They're human. I love them. They love me, and it worked. So eventually my father would send me word that I could come back. And that happened 3 times. The last time it happened, it wasn't for anything. In fact, only once I was accused of giving that kind of information to Malcolm. The other 2 times it was for differing with the concept of God in the Nation of Islam. I was insisting upon the Muslims believing the concept of God in the Quran, in the holy book of the Muslims, that my father gave us. And that kind of language was not good for the Nation of Islam because they were using a different they had a different concept of God. So I understood.
How would you specify those 2, just for people who don't know anything about it?
Well, the concept of God that we were given was God incarnate, God in the flesh, God as a man. But even stronger than what we know of in the other religions, and Christianity is one of them, the God incarnate for us was not a God that descended from an invisible reality into the body. We believe that the God was always like the Egyptian pharaohs.
Oh, I see.
That the divinity was passed on from father to son, you know, and nothing said of where it came from at all, except on earth. In fact, we were told that God doesn't exist in any form except man, and that there is no heaven except the condition that will come in you now, and there's no hell except the condition that will come in you now. There's no life after death except mental resurrection, you see? So this is the kind of teaching that we were given, and I believe the Sadducees of the Old Testament were very much like that too, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's nothing new, you know. I don't think we created this, you know. Everybody want to blame blacks now for all these things, you know. It came from somewhere else. So the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had hurt in him when he told me I had to go. I know my father. He didn't want to put me out. He didn't have any real serious problem with me believing the way I believed. The problem was what that would do to the community that he was heading. So I had to be put out. And he accepted me back after Malcolm's assassination. I timed it. I say Malcolm is assassinated, and I felt desperate too. I said Malcolm is assassinated now, and it was just before the convention, February convention. I said all those people get there, this may be some disturbance. I said I would like to be standing by my father's side. We have to make a show of unity. So I contacted my father and told him of my desire. He said, well, son, this time you have to tell the people you're wrong. And really, every time you're out, the rule was, whenever you come back, the first thing you have to do is stand up there and tell them, admit your sin, you see. But I didn't have to do it on the previous 2 times. But for this time, he said, you have to do it. And I understood it, so I accepted. And I asked him, could I tell it like I wanted to? He said, how are you going to tell it? So I said, I'm going to say I shouldn't have questioned your authority. He said, that's okay, son, and that's all I did. And they accepted me back, and they were so happy. They thunderous applause for me. The ministers and everybody at the convention, the place was filled, maybe 15, 20,000 people there. And they welcomed me back. And I stayed in good graces for some time, and then I was reported for saying something on the radio. I was questioned again. That got me in better shape with my father. So they called me to the hearing. It was on a Sunday. The staff was there, all the big people there. And my father said, son, they gave me a tape of you on the radio. He said, we're going to listen to it. He hadn't even listened. He listened to it right before.
Oh, he hadn't heard to it?
No. He saved it so he could play it while I'm there, you see. So he said, he listened, and at one point he jumped up and he clapped. And my mother was there. He said, Clara, isn't this what we wanted? And she had that bright smile of hers, and she smiled and she nodded her head like that. So he actually wanted me to be different. He didn't want me to follow the language of the Nation of Islam. That tape was altogether different from the language of Islam. It wasn't what we call Orthodox Islam, but it was it showed that I had come into a different mind, and that's what he wanted, I'm sure.
Well, that's a great story. Vincent, I'd like to give you the opportunity to ask a question or two. This seems to be an appropriate time to maybe make a slight shift here and ask you for your intervention, if you would, please.
Okay, I'm afraid I don't have the ability to reminisce as Dr. Lincoln has. This is the first time I've met you. But I have to say that since first becoming exposed to Islam in 1971 and first embracing Islam in 1974, I've followed you and your career extremely closely. As you know, that was a time in which about the only American Muslims that one ever saw were African-American Muslims. European-American converts like myself were very rare. And we've now come forward, I think, to a great extent to the point where now both groups are becoming more accepted in our own society. And what I'd like to do is to, since I have no ties with the past in that sense, what I'd like to do is to move things a little bit toward the future. And sort of coming from the starting point of the fact that you're, I think, fairly considered by many people today to be the spokesperson for Islam in America. I was wondering in particular what kinds of ties your organization and the people who follow you have with international Islamic bodies, with various Muslim countries. Do you maintain close ties with them? Are they formalized kinds of ties? Are they informal ties? What is the nature of these contacts that you carry on?
Yes, we're fortunate. We began to get some support in terms of Islamic publications, Qurans, from Rabita, you know, World Muslim League, based in Mecca. It's an international organization, worldwide organization, and also from the Islamic Cause Society at one time. We got the indication that they wanted to support us Islamically. And in time, things began to develop that brought us in direct contact with the head of the Department of Higher Education in Saudi Arabia, Dr. Abdullah Turki, and with Dr. Nassif, the chairman.
Ahmed Nassif.
But yes, yes, right, for Rabata. Also, as you know, I was given an invitation in Fez. I went there and participated at that meeting, which was very important, very significant for us as American Muslims who had made the transformation to the way of the Prophet, the Quran, and the way of the Prophet, the prayers and peace be on him. And that relationship has been, I would say, more informal than formal. We have always gotten, I would say, an invitation from Pakistan, but we haven't yet made the connection. But the invitation is still there for us to have a real relationship with Pakistan, and I'm anxious to see that materialize for us. The King of Morocco also opened his arms to us in the same way, but no formal connection except with any country but Saudi Arabia. We do have a formal connection, a formal relationship with them. It's growing. I think it's still in its infancy, but it is growing. And in many ways, we have achieved great things because when we took the position that Saddam was the aggressor and his behavior was un-Islamic, we won more friends in Saudi Arabia, which is understandable.
Of course.
And we put ourselves at risk, you know. In fact, I was there when the war broke out. I was there. I was the second day of my visit there, the war broke out. So that endeared us more to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I had an opportunity with my associates, my colleagues, on 3 occasions, big numbers of us, like 16 and 21, big delegations there in Saudi Arabia as guests of the Department of Higher Education, and on one occasion as guests of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to see the industrialization and what they had achieved there. That relationship to me is one that I can't put a dollar value on. And I am hoping to build upon it. I have great respect for the school of thought of Saudi Arabia. I don't belong to any particular school of thought, and I don't advise any of my colleagues to begin to promote any one school of thought. I believe that in time, our independent thinking will bring about a school of thought in America, not alone by ourselves, but perhaps with Muslims converted from America like yourself and others, you know, that we will eventually have a school of thought in America. That's my hopes and that's my belief. But to say we have any, the young ones coming up, the young princes, I do believe that they are beginning to question now their own previous perception of Islamic law. And as you know, they came out with a statement that hit the Wall Street Journal, have made news in the New York Times, and there seems to be a real indication that we're going to see some movement toward real democratizing of that society.
Structure of the
yes.
society.
Yes, the structuring of the society along more democratic lines. And I think that's only a beginning.
Well, as you know, there's sort of an ongoing debate about the nature of Islamic law in the Muslim world and whether or not the schools of law should be maintained. If they are, what should be kept? If they aren't, what replaces them? And of course, that leads to a very germane question in regard to Islam in the United States. As you know, of course, there are very few people in the United States at all who are trained formally as experts in Islamic jurisprudence.
That's true.
And what do you think Muslims in America ought to do about this? You mentioned also a while back that you thought there is coming a time in which America may have its own approach to Islam and perhaps its own interpretation of Islamic law. What is being done in the Islamic community here in America today, particularly in your community, but in anything else you might have seen as well, to foster the development of a sort of a new approach of this sort?
Nothing yet in an organized way, but the interest is beginning to grow. I'm meeting with imams from the Pakistani community, which is, you know, very large, perhaps the largest one,
yes,
the largest one in America, and a few others. And I'm getting an indication that they tend to favor more than disfavor this kind of thinking, a thinking of having our own school of thought one day in America. Yeah.
Isn't it true that what we are really talking about is one faith and many cultures? And each culture brings to the faith its own interpretations of what the faith means. That is universal. It's not restricted to Islam. It is also true in Christianity and Buddhism and every other great religion. Because religion is, if it is anything at all, a projection of the experiences of the society. That's one of the things that religion is by its very nature. And the experiences of, say, the society in the Persian Gulf are quite different from the experiences of society here in America. So there are going to be those cultural differences because we have varied sources from which we draw our values. And the question, the critical question is whether one can reasonably maintain the critical values of his culture under the canopy of a universal faith. That's what the critical question is, and that raises another issue for myself, and that is this. The great contribution of the black Muslims, as far as I am concerned, is that over 30 or 40 years, they brought Americans to an awareness of a religion other than Judeo-Christianity. Before the coming of Elijah Muhammad, there was no responsible awareness in this country of any other way of faith. True, the Nation of Islam was looked upon as exotic, but as it gained staying power and stayed and stayed and stayed, it became less and less and less exotic. So that today, people walking down the street, if they meet a Muslim, they don't feel that they have had an extraordinary experience.
Only if they meet an African-American Muslim.
I'm sorry?
Only if he's African-American or she's African-American.
Well,
when they're Anglo-American, it's quite an extraordinary experience.
Well, at any rate, what the Nation of Islam accomplished over its many years is to reduce the notion of exoticness about Islam in this country. And the other thing was that the Nation of Islam gave us what you might call a critical core of people who are Islamic. Never mind what shades of Islam, but whenever there is a critical core, whenever you get to the point where people are no longer appalled or excited about the presence of a group, then it is at that point that that group can begin to grow. It seems to me that that is what is happening now, that once you reached a certain point, then it became no big deal for a person to decide to become Muslim. Now, the New York Times in February of 1990 said that Islam had become the second major religion in this country, that it had displaced Judaism in terms of numbers. I thought the Times figures were perhaps a little premature, but nevertheless, this is what they say. But the point is this: we do see an increasing presence of Islam all across the country. There are mosques where there were no mosques before. There are Muslims where there were no Muslims before. And because of our various military, geopolitical, and economic needs, there are more and more and more people who happen to be Muslims coming into the country and taking their place in the American society. So undoubtedly, whatever the authenticity of the New York Times estimate, Islam is growing and growing and growing and growing. What do you see down the road? Is there going to, is the fact of the relatively rapid growth of Islam going to, for example, have a cultural fallout? And if it is, what will it be? Is it going to have a political fallout? And if it is, what will it be? What do you see down the road as a result of the enormous growth of Islam in the past 10 or 15 years?
I don't see any real dangers down the road, and I know that there is a good chance that there will be Muslims who, for some reason, and most of it is lack of acquaintance with the American people, the plurality of the American people and the many cultures here in this country. For example, Chinese come here, they keep to their old traditions, they live here, nobody disturb them, they live good lives here, they are successful here in America. They might not be seeing these things, you know. They might not be seeing the truth, and that is that America welcomes people to come here and enjoy the blessings of America without changing their culture. You don't have to change your culture. In fact, America has provided for the plurality of the cultural life in this country, that many ethnic groups and with their different cultures live here, and that's the beauty of America. Americans, going back even to 30 and 40 years ago in my childhood, I remember hearing old people speak of the different, and you know, and they may have a problem with some of them, but they spoke of that as the beauty of America, that America opens her arms to all cultures, people of all cultures. And if Muslims can see that and appreciate that and identify in that plural culture of America and understand that a special invitation is extended to them just as extended to all other groups to live here in America and keep their identity, I don't think we have a problem. But already I am sensing that some Muslims do have a problem, and they think that the culture, the melting pot, the culture of America threatens their culture. And some of them in haste are thinking to have some kind of political influence so one day they can bring about some kind of a change, not separate states like the Honourable Elijah Muhammad called for, but something too drastic for us to live comfortably with each other in this country. I know that that problem is there, but I don't think there's enough support for it. The support for it is weak. The support is growing for the kind of appreciation that I have and that you have and that most of us have for the openness of this country, the welcome in this country to people to come here and come with your religion, come with your culture, and you have a place here in this country. I think more Muslims, nationalized citizens, immigrants, they're beginning to believe that. They always knew it was said to them, but I think now they're beginning to believe it. And I think we have had a real role, Dr. Lincoln, in bringing about that, that kind of awakening in nationalized citizens of this country from overseas. We have had a real role in awakening that in them and making them feel a little more comfortable with their identity. We're not going to be Pakistanis, you know. I'm talking Muslims themselves now. We're not going to become Pakistanis and Palestinians, or Iraqis, or Saudis. We're going to stay African Americans. You know, a few of us drift off, you know, go out into the twilight zone on their own, you know, but not with us.
Well, we do that in Christianity.
I don't see any real danger down the road. I don't think there's going to be any real cultural clash down the road.
But there are tensions, aren't there? You know,
yes, there are tensions.
In the years that I've been Muslim, I've had a chance to live in two of the largest Islamic communities. That's 10 years in Los Angeles and 2 years in the Chicago area. And in both places, of course, the leaders of Islamic organizations always are saying the same sort of thing. We have to transcend culture. We have to get back to the basic roots of Islam. We have to follow, as you say, the principles of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and reconstitute the Brotherhood of Medina at the time of the Prophet and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But in reality, of course, you know better than I do what happens. In the Chicago area, just about every mosque is ethnically oriented.
Certainly.
You've got one that's almost all Indo-Pakistani. You've got one that's Arab and Yugoslavian. The Arabs and Yugoslavians are at each other's throats.
I like that.
You've got another...
I don't like them being at each other's throats.
Well, but they're often at each
But I like them sticking with their culture, sticking with their cultural traditions.
Well,
like
but
that.
then again, you have situations, too, where, okay, they try to overcome the cultural traditions, but what happens is that, to be perfectly personal about it, your people and my people get cut out sometimes. You know, one thing that Anglo-American
Then we ought to get together and see what we can do.
Well, perhaps we made a start over here. I think it's a great idea. But you know, one thing that we've all tasted together is this idea from certain Muslim groups and organizations, from people who've come over to the United States, that, well, you know, welcome to the fold, you're my brother, but, you know, stay away from my sister.
Yeah.
All right, that's an old story, of course.
You're getting that too, huh?
Oh, of course, sure. Yeah, believe me, we have more in common than you might think. And so, but this is a real problem. And I find also in dealing with many different Islamic centers from these various communities that there is a difference in terms of needs and orientations between communities that are immigrant communities, and this is something I think that even non-Islamic immigrant communities have had as well, and those communities of people like ourselves who come from this culture and are born in this culture. What happens is that, for example, in education, in many Islamic centers, the education of immigrant Muslims is designed to preserve what they are afraid of losing. The idea is that what's frightening to them is the melting pot you were talking about.
Right, that's right.
And so on one hand, they're happy that they can express their beliefs politically. On one hand, they're happy they can find people of their own kind and, say, speak their own language or something like that. But they're desperately afraid that their children are going to become Americanized. And so then what happens is that the education for their children is what's stressed in Islamic education, not the education, say, of African-Americans or Anglo-American Muslims who might come in. And also, of course, there are very important bars to marriage and types of social intercourse of that sort, which I think are still real problems. And have you found in your own career that these difficulties tend to arise in your associations or your contacts with Islamic centers in the Chicago area or anywhere else you might have had that experience?
Yes. Well, hey, you know my past. I've never been an integrationist, okay? So maybe I don't see a lot of things that others are seeing. Intermarriage, to me, is something that I don't want. Intermarriage with another people. I don't care if they're the Muslim people. I don't want to see my children intermarry into a Pakistani family and stuff. Although some members of my brother has a daughter who's married Pakistani, married to a Pakistani man, an Indian man, a Pakistani man. But to me, I don't favor that. I don't favor that. I'm not racist, but I have a race pride. And I think this is Islamic to have a race pride. I'm not an ethnic who is fanatical, but I have ethnic pride. And the only hurt in me is that we haven't built upon a solid ethnic identity for African-American people. We haven't built on that enough. We have something to build on, too, but we haven't built on it enough. So I can't share this feeling with you too well, you know.
Okay.
They can isolate me if they want to, as long as it's not out of Islam. I'm comfortable. But my way is to stress, I think we need alliances. All people need alliances. And as a citizen of this country, my alliance is first of all with all American citizens, you know. But as a citizen of Islam, that's an international community. As a citizen of Islam, my alliance in America is first of all with American-born people, the indigenous African-American people and Caucasian people. That's my alliance is first with them. Now, I know when the immigrant Muslims are there, they're going to be surprised. But we know each other. We have more in common. We have the same life in common, you see. So I think we have that makes more sense for me to be closer to you than to be close to somebody who I have to learn all about, and they have to learn all about me, and we have so many problems, you see. What I would suggest is that more Native Americans get together who are Muslims and work for the good future of Islam in this country, and at the same time try to strengthen our relationship with all the ethnic groups or cultural groups that come from overseas. Do both.
Do you see that there's a change coming, say, in terms of the children of immigrants? Do you find them?
Yes, they are.
Do you find them
changing.
more
Yes.
more like, say, you and
they-
I culturally in terms of values and Americanized?
Yes, and believe me, it's because of that attitude. They're only losing. They're only increasing the number of their children that's going to leave them with that attitude. That drives the young ones away from them.
You by being too insular.
Yes,
Yeah.
it drives the youngsters away from them. Yeah.
See, Eric, we are getting close to the bottom line, the end time. Do you have other remark or question or comment or recollection that you want to share?
Yes, it was implicit in my question a moment ago. It had to do with the political possibilities of the new Islamic presence. Towards the, in more recent times, even the old Nation of Islam people have begun to vote to hold office and so on, whereas before they shunned office holding. Now, in Orthodox Islam, which has taken in large numbers of African Americans, and which also includes now all of the ethnic groups that you were talking about, what kind of political response do you see in the future? Do you see political alliances that we have not yet experienced? What?
Yes, I do. You know, but I don't think there's so much political alliances as, well, there are political alliances, but more private interest groups. There's a need for more Muslims to compete with private interest groups in the lobby. So I'm for that. And I do see support for that growing in the future, where more Muslims, regardless to what nation they came from or what their ethnic group is, they will be coming together to lobby for Islamic interests. Yes. But as far as political blocs, I don't think we have that much in common to justify us having one political bloc, because our African-American situation is different from theirs. Theirs is different from others. Each one's different. So, so I think we will always tend to, our associates will always tend to vote with African-Americans and with Muslims and African-American Muslims and with non-African-American Muslims. That's what I would think.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to sort of take this moment to reflect on what we've done and what we have been able to do this afternoon, thanks to the presence of this group of distinguished guests, and to thank Dr. Vincent Cornell for bringing to us a perspective from the American community of Islam, of those who've been immigrants rather than indigenous members of that community, and Dr. Lincoln for bringing Imam Warith Deen Mohammed here and bringing also his own memory bank that makes us all feel that 35 years could be retold in 35 minutes, even if not all of it, at least some wonderful highlights. And especially I'd like to thank Imam Warith Deen Mohammed for coming to Duke and making it clear to all of us that we are not the epicenter of the Muslim community, but for this afternoon, you made us feel very close.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cornell.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much.